Welcome to another webinar from the Penn Project on the future of U.S.-China relations. My name is Nason Mahboubi. I'm the director of the project, and I'm coming to you today from sunny Vancouver, the site of this year's annual meeting of the Association for Asian Studies. The work of the Penn Project continues, notwithstanding this being spring break back home at the University of Pennsylvania and the AAS meeting here in Vancouver. Today, you'll be hearing from the National Security Fellows of our third fellowship cohort. As hopefully everyone who's watching this knows, we are currently in the midst of publishing the working papers of our third cohort fellows organized by thematic area and also having a webinar in connection with each of those sets of publications. And I'm really delighted about the discussion we're about to have on rethinking diplomacy and deterrence. Just before we engage in that conversation, I do want to remind everyone that the deadline for applying for our fourth cohort fellowship is on Tuesday, March 17th. So hopefully there are people out there who are in the midst of finalizing your applications. Please make sure to get them in by March 17th so you can be part of a group like this a year from now. Without further ado, let me invite today's speakers up on screen and we'll get today's conversation going. Wonderful. So moderating today's discussion is Brian Hart, who was one of our second cohort fellows, so an alumnus of this program, and more importantly, is Deputy Director and Fellow in the China Power Project at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. Our third cohort fellows will be presenting their work in today's discussion. Our Elsa Kania, Adjunct Senior Fellow at the Center for a New American Security. Xiaoyu, Professor of Political Science at the University of Nevada, Reno. And Neil Thomas, Fellow in the Asian Society Policy Institute's Center for China Analysis. I hope I got that all right, Neil. So with that, I am going to log off and hand it over to Brian.
Well, thank you, Nason. And first of all, thank you to you and all of your team at Penn for the work that you do to make this program a success. It was a real privilege to be part of the second cohort of fellows. I learned a lot from our trips to China, our briefings in Washington, and also just so much from the other fellows in the program. So I strongly recommend people who are watching this to apply to join the next cohort. And it's great to be here today with all of you for this panel. So, just as a quick kind of level setting before we dive into the different papers and research topics that each of the panelists have here, I think it's really valuable to take a step back and think about where we are when it comes to national security in China here in the United States. When I was a fellow with this cohort, we were in the later years of the Biden administration, and really the landscape of national security has changed quite dramatically under the Trump administration, especially when it comes to China. If you look at the Trump administration's national strategies, the national security strategy, the national defense strategy, they're markedly different in tone and focus, with this administration really focusing on Western Hemisphere issues and homeland defense, and thinking about that in a bit of a different way with respect to competition with China. That has trickled down into the way that this administration has talked about Taiwan and deterrence in the Indo-Pacific, in a new situation with U.S.-China relations. And I think as many have seen, President Trump has focused really heavily on the economic security front in ways that are different from his predecessors, with a real focus on using tariffs for leverage, and over the last year we saw a dramatic trade war between the U.S. and China that culminated in a bit of a trade ceasefire, if you will, in late 2025 when President Xi and President Trump met in South Korea, and things have remained relatively stable since then. But we are just weeks away from a planned visit President Trump to China to meet with Xi Jinping again in person. This would be the first trip to China since President Trump's last term. So it has been years since a president has visited China. So We have a lot to, I think, to unpack in this panel, both in terms of what has happened over the last several months and what we can expect going forward. But first, I think we'll turn it over to each of the fellows to kind of walk through the research topics that they're covering, and some of the recommendations that they're thinking about and crafting. And so, without further ado, I'll first turn it over to Elsia to walk through hers, and then we'll go from there. So, Elsa, over to you.
Thank you, Brian. And I wanted to start by saying thank you so much, Nason, and the whole team with the Penn Project. Wanted to echo that this really has been a phenomenal experience and would definitely encourage anyone watching to consider applying. Definitely a great learning opportunity, both with the trips, the workshops, and also just getting to know the whole cohort and all of the phenomenal expertise that the different fellows bring to the table across a range of issues. My project focused in particular on the impacts of US-Taiwan security cooperation on Beijing's calculus and the outlook for deterrence in the Indo-Pacific, and looking at some of these trends in US-Taiwan policy, US-Taiwan relations, some of the US efforts to bolster the credibility and capability of Taiwan's self-defense, juxtaposed with some of these trends in terms of Beijing's perceptions of the overall trajectory of Taiwan politics and policy. And among my findings were that there's a sort of unique and sometimes disconcerting juxtaposition between the ostensible confidence that Chinese leaders will espouse. For instance, Song Tao at the two sessions recently describing China's supposed comprehensive and overwhelming advantage over Taiwan expanding and his capacity as director of the Taiwan Affairs Office, and sort of claiming successes for Beijing's approach to what to the CCP terms the Taiwan issue or question, but at the same time, there is among many of the cross-strait specialists and scholars, especially in some of our conversations through our official meetings and academic exchanges last summer, a prevailing sense of impatience and pessimism about the prospects for truly peaceful unification, considering some of the trends in Taiwan politics, society, and public opinion that are seen as adverse to Beijing's interests and objectives with regard to Taiwan. And we've seen in recent years a doubling down on the use of military force and pressure as an instrument of CCP Taiwan policy, and seemingly not a lot of self-awareness or recognition from Beijing about the ways in which this pressure continues to backfire relative to their ostensible long-term objectives here. So something of a vicious cycle in that regard, including as we saw with regard to Justice Mission in late December, and the sort of ironic juxtaposition of these large-scale demonstrations of military force that Chinese leaders claim are necessary to deter or punish supposed inclinations towards Taiwan independence from Lai Ching-te's administration, as well as US support, against the backdrop of claims from Chinese leaders about their sincerity, they're still pursuing peaceful means. So definitely a sort of troubling tendency towards doubling down in that regard. We've seen in recent years another finding there was that obviously some of these changes in military posture and pressure have eroded warning, place Beijing in a position where the potential for use of force in a range of scenarios is easier transition relative to their more routine or routinized operations around Taiwan, which have been characterized to some extent as rehearsals or simulations of elements of a campaign, whether of a joint blockade or sort of simulation of a joint firepower strike, and even sometimes concerning claims from Chinese scholars that some of these coercive measures are all consistent with peaceful intent. And another major trend coming out of some elements of this research, both some informal interviews and textual evidence, is increased against the backdrop of the pessimism about some of the political trends, increased optimism about the military balance, that perception of advantage in Beijing's favor and closing the gap, and the extent to which, despite Taiwan's defense reforms, arms sales, and attempts to bolster military capability, the CCP still does not appear to see the power differential as meaningfully changed. So just briefly wanted to walk through a couple of the initial recommendations building upon those findings and concerns about the risks of a failure of deterrence, or risks that some of these trends are ultimately destabilizing. First, recommend that there is improved use of metrics by the Pentagon in looking at the effectiveness of different elements of US-Taiwan security cooperation and defense engagements, including monitoring some of the impacts these activities are having on Beijing's perceptions and more robust assessments of any impacts on the cross-strait balance, along with clear messaging of US intent and the objectives behind these strategies. Second, a focus on bolstering deterrence, including through accelerating the delivery of asymmetric and emerging capabilities, leveraging some of the mechanisms we've seen come into play around presidential drawdown authority, the Taiwan Security Cooperation Initiative, and also overcoming some of the arms sales backlogs that have been a persistent problem here. And then thirdly, given some of the risks of a rapid outbreak of a crisis, as we've seen vis-a-vis recent events, more coordination and planning and improvements in interoperability. So I'll pause there for now, but very much looking forward to my fellows' presentations and to continuing the conversation today and going forward.
Yeah, Elsa, thank you. And a critical topic, and one that I spend a lot of time thinking about, deterrence in the Indo-Pacific. Just as a quick follow-up, before we move to the next fellows, I wanted to ask specifically about Justice Mission 2025, which was, you mentioned, and that was the large-scale exercise that the PLA conducted around Taiwan in late 2025 in December. That came just, I think about 11 or 12 days after the announcement of a record large U.S. arms sale. If I remember correctly, I think it was about $11 billion estimated total value. Do you think, in your mind, is China responding to that those arms sales? Is that their reaction based on just the political signal that it's sending by the U.S. doing that arms sale, or do you think that a sale of that size does actually impact Beijing's thinking about deterrence in the Indo-Pacific? So I guess to rephrase differently, do you think that they just responded and they're worried about the political signal that the arms sale sends, or do you think that they are actually worried about the ways that such a large arms sale could potentially materially shift the balance of power across the strait?
I think so. I know there's been a lot of debate on this point. My initial reaction would be that this CCP will find excuses to stage these large-scale pressure operations around Taiwan, especially when there is some kind of event with a political valence, where there is a desire to try to punish the US or Taiwan for measures that are consistent with the Taiwan Relations Act, with longstanding trends in US-Taiwan relations, but are seen by Beijing as coming closer to some of the red lines or so-called bottom line that has been emphasized. So I think the reaction was very performative. There's been a fair amount with all of these pressure operations of cognitive domain operations, trying to have these cognitive effects against target audiences in the US and Taipei. I think there is an underlying concern or consideration of the effects of arms sales or specific weapon systems from a deterrent perspective, but there still tends to be this overriding representation of confidence that these measures are ineffective. And I think the needle may be starting to move on a couple discrete trends or capabilities, but for the most part, I think a lot of these pressure operations have been very much a theater of threats, so to speak, performative, aimed at political signaling, but also, of course, having the collateral advantages of allowing the PLA to test its preparedness, to demonstrate its capabilities in ways that are also intended to have these deterrent and coercive effects, and sort of looking to erode Taiwan's readiness given the responses required against the backdrop of those persistent day-to-day pressure operations that the PLA is also conducting. So I think that hopefully the cumulative impacts of arms sales and other forms of security cooperation will start to and will continue to move the needle in terms of deterrence and Beijing's perceptions of the military balance. But there's, I think, limited impact so far, especially when some of these arms sales are still some ways from delivery, which is why one of my recommendations is trying to focus on having more tangible impacts, accelerating the deliveries, and really facilitating the operationalization of emerging capabilities that could start to change that equation more in a way that ultimately could be stabilizing by bolstering and reinforcing deterrence.
Great. Yeah, I think there's a lot to dig into there when we turn to broader discussion. But so thank you. But next, I'll turn it over to Xiaoyu to talk a little bit about his research and findings on really the issue of securitization within U.S.-China relations. So Xiaoyu, thank you. Over to you.
Thank you. It's my great pleasure to join this panel to discuss national security. So, as Brian correctly pointed out, the current Trump administration almost like removed the notion of great power competition as the centerpiece of national security thinking. But on the other hand, we can estimate that in the long term, U.S.-China competition will continue. So then there is a fundamental question: how to manage national security without undermining the competitiveness of U.S. power. So that's sort of the core sort of question my paper tried to address. It's very good in a sense that the Penn Project allow us to sometimes write a paper, try to have some policy relevance, but not necessarily only address any particular administration, right? If we try to address like Chase, sort of Trump's latest tweet, then my paper probably will be outdated by tomorrow or the day after tomorrow. So I think that's the good thing about Penn Project is that allow us to have different kind of emphasis in this kind of discussion. So get back to my point: how to manage security without undermine American competitiveness, like innovation, economic prosperity, and also very importantly, global talent flow to the United States. All these are very crucial for American competitiveness. So my proposal, I think it's pretty much like a radically moderate proposal. So it's called, I label that bounded securitization. On the one hand, we need to recognize securitization is inevitable. So even during the current Trump administration. So think about U.S.-China competition, the weaponized interdependence, domestic politics, and also the sort of like action, interaction, reaction sort of dynamics between the United States and China. China also securitized a lot of projects, a lot of programs. So the United States, to some extent, has to respond. So securitization is inevitable. But the question is how to make securitization more bounded. So that's the focus of my paper. So I raise several sort of principles of bounded securitization. First is more nuanced threat assessment. So don't think everything like simply is possible, then everything is a threat, right? Make a careful differentiation between possible and probable. Second, cost analysis. Think about trade-off. National security all have trade-off. So carefully evaluate costs. Thirdly, is about institutional integrity. Even when we think about how to implement the national security, we need to maintain institutional integrity. Finally, is about accountability and feedback. So we need to think about how to get information, but also adapt and modify and change national security policy when whenever we got some new information and have new evaluation. So my recommendation focus on different dimensions. First, regarding small yard high fence, I argue this is still a good idea in principle as a framework, but we need to refine this framework. We need to have a better sort of communication. Think about how, in terms of the intention. The second is tiered economic security framework. In my paper, I emphasize for those technology economic items which have real military or security implications, it's very necessary to have a very tight security policy. However, for most other economic transactions, we need to allow, the US government need to allow those transactions. And also is for some items somewhere between, we need to think about, the US government need to think about using some sort of industrial policy, but don't using label everything as national security policy, right? Sometimes if the government need to use industrial policy, just do it, but don't say it's a national security, right? So carefully, but also the same about research security as well. So carefully manage different sort of domains with different kind of risk. And finally, in my recommendation, I talk about institutional guardrails, especially sunset clauses and periodical reviews. Because for bureaucrats or political institutions, government agencies, there's a general tendency to add more items to the securitized list, but it's more difficult to remove. So I think it's very important to have a more established periodical review mechanism to make sure the list will not become like a longer and a longer, never end. So my final point is that the United States can be secure and also be competitive. How to manage these two is very crucial. Let me stop there. Thank you.
Thank you, Xiaoyu. If I can, I wanted to maybe ask a question that puts your research and recommendations into a concrete issue that we've actually seen in the real world. And one of the things that, of course, popped into mind was with respect to small yard high fence, that has often been used really in the context of the sale of advanced semiconductors to China. And so one of the steps that we saw the Trump administration take was approving recently the sale of NVIDIA's H200 chips to China, which was very hotly debated here in Washington as to whether that is the correct move. So I'm curious as to whether you think that was that process that came about for approving that. Is that in line with kind of the way that you're thinking about the securitization issue or over securitization issue? Did that policy make sense, or do you think that that's a good example of what you're arguing for?
Mm-hmm. Okay, yeah, I think that kind of issue exactly touch upon my paper's core sort of question: how to balance these two. So on the one hand, we need to make sure those high-tech products with direct or dual use implications can be securitized. But on the other hand, we need to think about all the cost. So my position regarding that particular issue is that, I know people from different sort of policy perspectives have totally opposite idea. So as I said, my general position is somewhere between, is like sort of middle ground approach. I would oppose those ideas who totally ignore national security, say everything can be for sale. So I think that's wrong. But on the other hand, I also oppose those ideas talking about everything must securitized, or without consider the cost for business community, for innovation. So H200, I think it's not the most advanced version. In that sense, I think at least this item is debatable. So I'm not in principle oppose Trump's decision to sales, but I kind of disagree with the way the administration handled this. Is that there's maybe not enough deliberation, right? So it's not, I think the item itself, since it's not the most advanced, it's at least debatable. That's my position. Yeah.
Great. Thank you, Xiaoyu. Next, we'll turn it over to Neil to talk some about what his research into what he's calling multi-track diplomacy, I think, and the ways that some of the different maybe non-traditional modes of diplomacy can help keep U.S.-China relations stable. So, Neil, over to you.
Thank you, Brian, and thank you to Elsa and Xiaoyu for those fascinating presentations, and of course to the broader PEN project for making this all possible. Strongly encourage everyone to apply if you've got something you want to work on. So my project, as Brian mentioned, is about multi-track diplomacy in U.S.-China relations, and this refers to the several diplomatic tracks that complement formal state-to-state diplomacy that we all see in the open with China. And there are a few different tracks that I explored. The first was kind of the secret track one channels that sometimes play an important role that does involve, current office holders and political leaders, but it's things that, aren't part of it, the formal public bilateral relationship. So, for example, canonically Kissinger's secret trip to Beijing in 1971. More recently, the early stages of the dialogue between Chinese Foreign Minister Wang Yi and former National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan in Vienna to kind of stabilize US-China relations after the balloon incident. There's also a lot of kind of semi-official or unofficial track 1.5 or track 2 dialogues that involve not just think tankers and academics and business leaders, but also many ex-officials or perhaps current officials appearing in a personal capacity. And those help to exchange information, to send signals, generate policy ideas. But of course, they lack the binding authority of track 1 diplomacy. And then kind of to the side is legislative diplomacy. So people in Congress, their staff, having dialogues, doing trips, that can be a force multiplier for gathering information about what's going on in China, for political signaling, and for projecting resolve as well in terms of showing united front for Washington's foreign policy priorities. But kind of looking at, the findings about what exists out there, I think the conclusion I came to is there's not really any institutionalized process in the US government for keeping track of what's going on outside of formal channels or for making contributions to this, multi-track diplomacy. So there's not really any feedback loop between the government and all these different multi-tracks. And this gap means that opportunities to test out messaging, to float trial balloons, to keep track of the signals that policymakers in Beijing are sending from not just their official government spokespeople, but also from a whole range of political and kind of semi-political actors in the system. And specifically in 2020, there's a suspension of congressional exchange programs that were under the Mutual Economic and Cultural Exchanges Act, Section 108A, which many dozen countries do have exchange programs. And so that's contributed to a situation where fewer and fewer members of Congress and fewer staffers have ever visited mainland China, despite China being America's #1 strategic competitor. And I think this lack of first-hand exposure does contribute to something of an assessment gap. Like there's a lot of grandstanding about China, but I think, in my view at least, a lot of Washington anyway, doesn't quite appreciate China's domestic strengths and its actual challenges, but especially not its recent industrial and technological advances in recent years. So if you actually look at what's getting done, there's I'd argue a lack of urgency about investing in U.S. technological and economic revitalization in response to to what China's becoming actually very good at. Even if we previously might have been very critical of IP theft and the like. That's all very real, but we have to reckon with the fact that that's increasingly becoming a thing of the past in terms of what's making a difference for China's industrial self-reliance. And so I have a few kind of modest recommendations that follow on from that diagnosis of the situation. The first is that the White House should establish a uh, periodic, review of both, the utility of back channel diplomacy, but also how the executive can use and play into track 1.5 and track 2 diplomacy. Secondly, to have a more formal, at a lower level, have a kind of more formal effort to both do pre-briefings and debriefings with, the kind of major track 1.5 and track 2 exchanges that some of the, universities and think tanks in America have with policymakers or kind of influential policy advisors in the mainland, with, to both, inform and update on security risks and the experience of people on the ground, but also, as I was saying before, to, ensure that messaging about what the situation is in Washington is correct and that and also to kind of collect information about what the response to US messaging is after the fact. And then thirdly, I think that the president should direct the Secretary of State to restore the exchange programs with China under Section 108A of the Mutual Educational and Cultural Exchange Acts. Makes it easier for federal employees, members of Congress and their staff to go to China. They were banned in 2020 as or removed because they were called soft power propaganda tools, and that is exactly what China's trying to do with many of these things. But I think it's a little bit ridiculous to suggest that Americans devoted to public service are going to be convinced to give up that conviction and their patriotism with a Peking duck dinner. I think they serve a very useful function in terms of actually enhancing policymakers' knowledge of their Chinese counterparts. Not going to agree on many things, but they're going to get a better sense of what China's like. Go to the Huawei factory, go to the BYD factory, see these things up close and viscerally, and really get a sense for what America's up against, quite frankly. And also, I think it helps to generate more insight into, differentiating between what's real and what's not in Beijing's messaging, and just, gives legislators more authority, quite frankly, in terms of knowing what they're talking about when they come back and try to, legislate responses to China's rise. And I'll leave it there.
Thanks, Neil. Yeah, really interesting stuff. And as someone who works in a think tank, these are also the track 2s and track 1.5s are things that you and I are both often thinking about, especially. So a really great topic. I wanted to follow up with two questions actually related to kind of the congressional side of things that you recommended. One question is, you've framed the issue as largely being one of the challenge or one of the limiting factors here is that the U.S. isn't getting enough information by not visiting China. But I'm also wondering from the flip side of that, if you think that there are things that it would be useful for China to understand about the United States from doing more of these congressional visits. Are there things that members of Congress and their staff would be conveying that they wouldn't be hearing from example, from the White House? So that's one question. And then two is, I guess, what are the big constraints on some of these these CODELs and staff DELs to China? Is it a matter of interest and kind of concern on the congressional side about going to China, or is it more kind of material factors like costs and things like that? What are the big constraints that have kind of limited? Now that we're in the post-COVID era, what are the big limits now that kind of deter people from going to China?
Thanks, Brian. Great questions. On the first question, the first thing I'd say is that Beijing itself, I think, invests a lot more than Washington does in getting its policymakers and its policy advisors, people in think tanks and universities to the United States to gather thoughts and impressions from a whole range of think tanks here, from very conservative to very progressive, from people on both sides of the aisle. They are very keen to do these meetings, and they see it as incredibly valuable for making policy at up to the highest levels. I mean, and they have a quite well-developed process of debriefing and writing reports for policymakers after these types of visits. And I think there's frankly something that we can learn from that in terms of making our diplomacy more effective towards China. And I think in terms of the messages that American interlocutors can bring to China, I think it is important, especially the higher you go in the system. And there are in Track 1.5 dialogues, people at the vice ministerial, the ministerial level, perhaps sometimes even higher, who are involved in these. And there are some issues of information silos in Beijing, much like there might be for different parts of Washington as well. And so the more directly you can communicate the level of concern in the United States about, say, fentanyl or about China's activities in the Taiwan Strait, I think the better in terms of emphasizing what red lines are and providing credibility, more credibility to top level messaging. I mean, Trump will talk to Xi in a few weeks' time. And that's great, but there is an awareness that there's Congress and there's different parties. And so if that messaging that's going into the Chinese system, obviously, Trump is the most important messenger. He's the president, of course. But if that message, say on fentanyl, right, is bipartisan, which it is, then I think that only, that does move the needle in the Chinese response. And there's a way to go there. But Chuck Schumer's delegation with a bipartisan delegation of senators in 2023, by all accounts that I've heard, that was an important part of the diplomatic progress that was made on fentanyl at the Biden-Xi meeting the next month. And some progress is better than no progress, frankly. So I think that's an important example. And to your second question, quickly about constraints, I think one constraint that has existed, especially in the immediate aftermath of COVID, when there's a lot of, very nasty sentiment coming out of Beijing, frankly, about, blaming the US and the Fort Derrick base for starting it, like total nonsense, the peak of wolf warrior diplomacy. China was, very toxic on Capitol Hill. And China has pulled back from some of those more extreme positions, but there's a lot of concern, I think, about being seen as, as soft on China just by interacting with Chinese policymakers or visiting China. And I don't think that's true. That's quite it's a low degree of confidence you're exhibiting there in America and the strength of American ideals. So if you're confident in yourself, I don't think that you should be afraid of interacting with anyone, quite frankly. And so I think that, that's been a constraint, the politics. But with Trump going now, whatever one thinks of the outcomes of the trip, we'll see what happens. I think that has opened the Overton window slightly for at least getting people on these trips. And so I think that constraint's perhaps loosening. But I do think there should be, some very serious pre-departure briefings on electronic security, on influence operations, on the broader Chinese political system, to make sure that people who might not have a foreign policy background, go in eyes wide open and know how to get the most out of these trips for American foreign policy without compromising any national security interests.
Okay, awesome. Well, thank you, Neil. I wanted to flag, we just posted this in the chat to remind everyone, but I wanted to raise it here too. So for any of those watching in the audience on the Zoom webinar, you can submit any questions for our fellows and I will do my best to monitor that and raise those questions here for everyone. For now, I guess I do have a question that I think actually really could be answered by all of you in different ways. And so maybe I'll turn it to each of you to kind of raise, answer this from your perspective and your research that you're doing. I think one of the things that we constantly have to deal with in dealing with China is misperception on both sides, but I mean, on the Chinese side, there are misperceptions of U.S. actions. One of the interesting things, if you look at some of the national documents that the Trump administration has put out, for example, they're very clear to say things like the United States is not trying to humiliate or contain China, we've seen Trump administrations say that in a couple of different settings, and I think it's notable. They're doing that intentionally. But I think Beijing, often still is concerned about U.S. intentions in all of these areas. So I was just wondering what you see as in your research and your engagements with PRC scholars and officials. I'm wondering what you see as the biggest Chinese misperceptions on their side in your area. Elsa, given the range of misperceptions, I think on both sides on the Taiwan issue, maybe I'll turn to you to start and just to get your thoughts on this.
That's a great question. And the first that comes to mind is how deeply rooted there seems to be a perception in Beijing, as reflected in PRC state media, elements of the propaganda, as well as seemingly genuine articulations from Chinese scholars and think tankers, that US intentions vis-a-vis Taiwan are purely aligned to using Taiwan to contain China, playing the Taiwan card, these tropes that are repeated recurrently. And I think there isn't always an appreciation in Beijing that there is genuine US commitment to Taiwan self-defense that is deeply bound up in our shared history, in the Taiwan Relations Act and the commitments that we've made that date back decades, that Congress has very strong opinions on Taiwan policy, that there's a great admiration and appreciation of Taiwan's democracy and human rights, that it's not simply sort of, as you alluded to, this sort of American conspiracy to contain China and exploiting Taiwan to that purpose, that there is this sort of shared purpose, and that a lot of the measures that Beijing tends to view cynically, such as arms sales, are very much a response to a perception of the threat that the CCP itself is presenting as reflected in PLA pressure operations. So I think there is this cognitive dissonance sometimes, and yeah, it was always interesting talking to various interlocutors in Beijing, as we did during our trip, and just how much there is that deep perception and cynicism, or even sort of tendency towards viewing US intentions in the worst possible light, and sort of also this lack of awareness that China's behavior and actions are driving many of these reactions. So there is sort of this, whether we call it a insecurity dilemma of sorts, or sort of a reaction action cycle, where I think there's not always been much of a capacity in the CCP's Taiwan policy ecosystem to recognize that the threats and pressure and attempts to sort of deter or intimidate the US and Taiwan are having the opposite effects, because a lot of these US policy actions are driven by a sense of CCP intentions, and some of what we've seen in the past couple of years vis-a-vis PLA training, exercises, operations, as making that threat real and credible. So a lot of other misperceptions or unique features of perceptions in Beijing on this issue I could get into, but that is the first that comes to mind, especially in light of several of the conversations we had during our cohort's trip last summer, where a lot of those views keenly came through in nearly every meeting. And I guess I would just juxtapose that with also a sense of the US being a unitary actor sometimes. And I mean, I think that was reflected in responses to Speaker Pelosi's visit. I think there's sometimes a tendency to see a high level of coordination or deliberate coincidence of aspects of policy from different branches of government or different elements of the US system that are not always as deliberately orchestrated as observers in Beijing may anticipate.
Yeah, thanks, Elsa. And you actually just raised something that I was going to connect to Neil's on this question, which was the Pelosi visit in 2022 to Taiwan, and the ways that the Chinese system often doesn't either, even if they understand, they don't always appreciate the differences within the U.S. System and the ways that not only on a partisan level do we act differently, but even from the different branches. And so to that, so I'll turn that to Neil. For you, because one of the questions that generates for me is in this current state where I think President Trump is being particularly influential on China policy, and is really focused on the leader level meetings with Xi Jinping, and I think that's why there's eagerness for this summit in a couple of weeks. Do other voices matter? Do you think the Chinese side appreciates the voices of others in the system, or do they really weigh those do they weigh those enough given the influence of President Trump and I guess on the Chinese side, the influence of President Xi personally? Do these other voices matter?
Yeah, it's a really great question. And I mean, at this moment right now, they certainly, I think, matter less than they would have, say, 18 months ago. But they also might start mattering more again in the future. I mean, if the Democrats win the House in the midterms in November, then you have, two parties in different parts of the power system in DC, actually controlling a branch of government. So yeah, right now, of course, Trump is, as some people have said, his own desk officer on China. He's really centralized decision making in a kind of like Xi Jinping did in some ways when it comes to the U.S.-China relations. But there is still ideas being fed up to the Trump administration about all sorts of things that the US and China could be working on, or things that the US needs to be more competitive on. So, there are still inputs that the administration needs for China policy. That Trump himself, needs. He likes to hear different ideas and kind of have them compete against each other. So there are different. It is more than just Trump who is having an impact on American policy towards China. And I think that a lot of scholars, policy advisors, policymakers, even in Beijing, do appreciate that. But it will, of course, kind of there'll be peaks and troughs in terms of how useful, influential multi-track diplomacy is. And so these recommendations are intended to not be just for this moment, but looking into the future as well.
Yeah, it's a great point. Xiaoyu, over to you, and I guess I'll frame this slightly specifically for your research. And to use the H200 chip example again, just as an example, is even when the administration made that decision, many in China then there was discourse saying that the decision was actually just a trap by the United States to keep China hooked on these chips, and so even when the United States takes this step to maybe remove some of the restrictions and sell to China, there's distrust on Beijing on that front. So I'm wondering, if we take some of your recommendations to be more rigorous about the way that we avoid over securitization, how do we convey that to China in a way that meaningfully shapes their thinking on it?
Mhm. Yeah. So I think I will address first in a broader sense, then in a specific. In a broader sense, I think like the PRC analysis officials now they find some sort of like a reassuring message from Trump's sort of policy frame, like a narrative, like a removing great power competition as the centerpiece of U.S.-China policy. But on the other hand, they still don't have like a long-term sort of confidence regarding U.S.-China stability. So they still sort of to some degree prepare for some worst case of like a bad situation. So in that sense, so this relate to my second point is that both sides now are rethinking interdependence in a broader sense. So both sides want to, on the one hand, reduce dependency on the other side, but also maintain the other side's dependency on yourself. So I think that's the situation in both Washington and DC. In that sense, regarding like chips. So I think the Chinese policymakers, they even they find like the current Trump administration, this might be good in the short term, but they don't trust that this is a long-term solution. So in that sense, I think it's difficult for the United States to totally change their perception. But on the other hand, I think this is almost like a security dilemma in economic domain, in a sense that I think some kind of dialogue or more communication, sometimes a little bit more transparency, can still build some minimum sort of confidence, right? So I think we cannot totally sort of imagine the distrust disappear, but some kind of confidence building is still necessary to reduce this kind of economic security dynamic, almost like that. Yeah.
Okay, yeah, thank you, Xiaoyu. We do have a question from the audience, and it's one I'm not at all surprised that we're getting. So I think it's one worth asking to the panel, and it's not directed at anyone. So feel free for anyone to answer this. But the question is, given that the United States is currently devoting a great deal of attention and resources to domestic political issues and conflicts in the Middle East, does the US government still have the time and capacity to carefully formulate a coherent strategy towards China? Are American policymakers more likely to simply maintain existing China policies rather than develop new ones? And then I would add my own kind of maybe provocative question on this is, are we paying enough attention to China given everything that's going on? So I don't know if anybody specifically wants to jump in on this.
I'm happy to provide a quick reaction. I think that, yeah, China has really kind of fallen off the radar a bit compared to where it was under the first Trump administration and then the Biden administration. As we've seen, more of a hemispheric focus, and obviously the strike on Venezuela, and now also, going back to some of America's longstanding concerns in the Middle East with Iran and the conflict over the past couple of weeks, which, who knows when it's going to finish. I'm not sure we have anything like an end date yet. So, in that sense, yeah, I mean, it feels a bit strange actually for US-China relations to not be in the headlines more regularly. And I think that, whatever one's views are of China's rise, it's undeniably the most important trend still in international geopolitics and international political economy. And so, yeah, I think Washington should be paying a lot more attention to China.
So
Anybody else want to chime in? Elsa?
Sure. I was just going to say, I do think that, the US policy apparatus and government does have a great deal of capacity. And to some extent, I don't think it's necessarily a question of developing new policies. I think we've seen actually a fair amount of continuity on some fronts across the last several administrations. So I guess I'd say I think that there is definitely a lot in the news, a lot of recent events that are definitely capturing headlines. But I do think a lot of the fundamentals of US policy and strategy have remained more consistent, or there's been more continuity than you might expect on to some extent relative to the level of attention and headlines looking at other regions of the world. So hopefully there will be that continue to be that capacity to focus on this core strategic challenge and some of the fundamental considerations when it comes to China's rise, to deterrence, to maintaining a course in the US-China relationship that is conducive to America's long-term competitiveness.
Yeah, Xiaoyu, anything from you?
Yeah. So two quick reaction. Number one is that maybe the Middle East, Iran war potentially could be a distraction. But on the other hand, my second point is that I think it's justifiable for domestic issue to rank behind or beyond above any international issue. I think in the United States we need to focus on domestic issues. Domestic renewal, self-strengthening, even for long-term competition with any country. I think to some degree, Washington and Beijing now, righting or wrongly, both are pretty self-confident. I mean, for various reasons. So I think in the short term, that's a good thing. I mean, that just like in my undergrad class, all students want to get a score be above average. So that's a confident sort of positive attitude for future peace. I think. Yeah.
Great. Well, I think we're right, a few minutes left, maybe about 3, 4 minutes left. And so as we wrap up, I wanted to pose a quick question to you all, maybe in the reverse order that we started. So maybe Neil, I'll start with you and then go to Xiaoyu and then Elsa. But I think just to wrap up, as I mentioned earlier, the Trump-Xi summit is coming up unless something disrupts it in the end, but we can largely expect them to meet in about 2 to 3 weeks. Just curious as to what you'll be watching from that meeting, or maybe what your expectations are, or if you have any, advice that you hope President Trump might take with him. Yeah. So, Neil, start with you.
I'd expect a kind of lower profile summit maybe than the initial thought around this kind of first trip to China by a US president in 9 years. So I think we'll get continuity with the current truce that was agreed in South Korea by the two leaders late last year. Perhaps we'll see more purchase agreements by China for US grains and energy, maybe some Boeing purchases. I think Beijing will be lobbying the Trump administration to not increase tariffs again because they're in a better position after Supreme Court ruling on IEEPA than they were before. And perhaps there'll be some announcements about investment in each other's economy. What I'm not expecting is any kind of grand bargain to emerge or a fourth communique that attempts to resolve the Taiwan issue or anything like that. I'm sure there'll be some conversations and communication about that, but I don't think it's unlikely there'll be a big announcement in the strategic space.
Xiaoyu, over to you.
Some brief points. First is that I think I also lower my expectation to maintain optimistic view. I don't think there will be any like a huge breakthrough. But on the other hand, this will be the first like a U.S. sitting president to visit China in almost a decade. This kind of summit itself is a breakthrough, and also because both sides expect the top leaders will meet multiple times this year. That means at least in short term, we will expect some sort of like tactical stability, at least this year. Who knows next year or longer time. A second point is maybe some short-term trade truce maybe can continue. But my most I hope the third point is whether there will be some like a specific policy to improve people-to-people interactions, like a visa policy for U.S. citizens, whether that will be like visa-free as China treated other Western industrial countries, that will facilitate better people-to-people ties. So that's my sort of expectations. Thank you.
Thanks, Xiaoyu. And last but not least, Elsa, over to you.
Let's see. So would not be surprising were she to raise the issue or question of Taiwan, including in the context of arms sales with Trump, including in light of some of the previous reporting about their prior phone call back in February. So we'll be watching to see how much of any discussion on the topic comes out publicly, or any indications of the outlook for arms sales. But certainly there's a lot on the agenda in U.S.-China relations. I think Taiwan is one of the most critical and most challenging dimensions of that conversation to some extent, against the backdrop of many other timely issues. So this will be interesting to see the extent to which she attempts to gain any ground on that front, and with but I would hope and expect that nothing coming out of that convening would necessarily alter the fundamentals of U.S.-Taiwan relations, of our longstanding commitment to support Taiwan's self-defense, and the overall trends in this partnership and cooperation. So definitely lot in the news, lot to watch out for. Never boring for those of us who are trying to make sense of U.S.-China relations, policy, and world we live in these days.
Yeah, well, that's certainly true. Never a dull moment when you're studying China. Well, I'll turn it over to Nason now to close us out. But thank you to all three of you. This has been a real pleasure. You all have taken on really critical questions in your research. So it's been great to see you all work through these tough policy questions. And thank you all for joining on the panel. Nason, over to you.
I couldn't have said it any better, Brian. This was really superb and very nicely moderated by you, Brian. So you leave me almost nothing to say other than thank you all. Thank you for being part of this program. Thank you for sharing your views on the webinar. Thank you to the audience that we've had on the Zoom and also live on YouTube. And just a reminder that we still have 2 more of these sets of publications and webinars of our 3rd cohort. Next week, we will be hearing from our trade and economics fellows, and then the week after that from our science and technology fellows, right up to the likely, but as you say, who knows what will happen in this world, not yet fully certain summit between Presidents Trump and Xi Jinping that is currently scheduled for the end of March. With that, let me close things off. And again, thank you all for a really superb and outstanding discussion today.